370,000 people live in a city that floats. Every building is suspended above the ground on concrete stilts. Every water pipe runs through the open air, wrapped in insulation, because nothing can be buried. The ground beneath Yakutsk has not thawed in thousands of years, and that frozen ground is the only reason the city exists. But right now, degree by degree, it is warming, and nobody can stop it. This is not a story about cold. Every documentary about Yakutsk tells you about the cold, how eyelashes freeze, how car engines run all winter because if you turn them off, they will never start again. How metal burns skin on contact at -50. You already know that story. This one is different. This one is about what happens when the cold goes away. Because in Yakutsk, cold is not the enemy. Cold is the foundation, and the foundation is cracking. How does a city of nearly 400,000 survive on ground that must never be touched? What happens when the coldest city on Earth starts catching fire? And why is a place that should not exist growing faster than almost any other city in Russia? To understand why Yakutsk floats, you have to understand what is underneath it. Permafrost. Ground that has been frozen continuously for thousands of years, in some places extending more than 3,000 feet deep. When frozen, permafrost is harder than concrete. It can hold buildings, roads, entire cities. But it has one rule: it must stay frozen. The moment it warms, even slightly, it turns into something between mud and quicksand, and everything sitting on top of it begins to sink. Soviet engineers understood this. When they expanded Yakutsk in the 1950s and 60s, fueled by the discovery of diamond deposits that would eventually make the region one of the richest in Russia, they raised every building off the ground. Concrete piles driven 40 to 50 feet into the frozen earth, deep enough to reach a layer where the temperature never changes, hovering around 23 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The buildings sit suspended, a gap of several feet between the floor and the soil, so that heat from the apartments above does not radiate downward and melt the foundation beneath. Subscribe to Impossible Lands. In 3 minutes you will understand why the coldest city on Earth is not being threatened by winter, but by something no one anticipated. Walk through Yakutsk in January, and the first thing you notice is not the temperature, it is the fog. At -40 and below, the air becomes so cold that moisture from breathing, from car exhaust, from the heat escaping buildings, freezes instantly into a suspended cloud of ice crystals. They call it ice fog. Visibility drops to less than 15 feet. The city disappears into a white haze, where headlights blur into shapeless glows and pedestrians materialize from nothing, bundled in fur until only their eyes are visible. The university advises students not to walk outside when it drops below -40 Celsius. Schools stay open until -67 Fahrenheit, -67. In most of the world, that number does not exist on a thermometer. In Yakutsk, it is the threshold for a day off. But the cold is not static, it is architecture. Every pipe in the city runs above ground, thick with insulation, because burying anything means digging into permafrost and destabilizing the thermal balance that keeps everything standing. Water lines, sewage, heating, all of it exposed, running along the surface like the visible veins of an organism that cannot afford to hide its circulatory system. From above, Yakutsk looks like a city turned inside out, its infrastructure confessing what it cannot hide. At street level, the adaptations multiply. Stairs outside buildings are covered in heavy carpet, not for comfort but because frozen stone becomes as slippery as polished glass. Doors come in sets of 2 or 3, airlocks between the lethal outside and the heated inside. Glasses cannot be worn without risk. The metal frames freeze to skin, and removing them means tearing pieces of your face away. Cars sit in heated garages or idle in parking lots all winter, their engines running 24 hours a day, wrapped in thick blankets to trap whatever warmth the motor produces, because the alternative is fuel lines that solidify and batteries that crack in the cold. Tires left stationary too long deform into squares. The rubber hardens past the point of flexibility and will not return to its shape until temperatures rise, which in Yakutsk means waiting months. Windshields are fitted with double layers of glass. Food is not refrigerated, it is left outside, where the air does the work. Milk arrives at the open-air market as solid frozen blocks. Fish stands rigid, arranged upright in rows, perfectly preserved in a city-sized freezer that nobody built and nobody controls. No building in Yakutsk rises above 16 floors. The concrete piles that anchor each structure into the frozen ground can only support so much weight. This is a city where even ambition is constrained by what the earth will bear. And there is a detail that reveals everything about the stakes. If the centralized heating system fails for even a few hours, reports suggest that the entire population, nearly 400,000 people, would face an emergency evacuation, not because of discomfort, because without heat, at those temperatures, the interiors of apartments begin reaching lethal cold within hours. There is no backup, there is no waiting it out. In Yakutsk, heat is not a convenience. It is the single thread holding everything together. But here is where the story shifts. Because while the world imagines Yakutsk as a place trapped in permanent winter, the reality is that Yakutsk experiences the largest seasonal temperature swing of any inhabited place on Earth. 102 degrees Celsius, 184 degrees Fahrenheit. The same city that drops to -84 in winter has reached 101 Fahrenheit in summer. The same streets where ice fog blinds drivers in January fill with aggressive Siberian mosquitoes in July, and those summers are getting longer. In 2021, something happened that made the contradiction impossible to ignore. Wildfires, hundreds of them, spreading across the Republic of Sakha, the vast Siberian territory where Yakutsk is the capital, burning through millions of acres of boreal forest. More than 80% of Sakha is covered by taiga, and the region had already suffered its driest June in nearly 150 years. Temperatures in Yakutsk hit 95 degrees Fahrenheit that month, shattering records. The forest did not stand a chance. In a single season, the fires consumed an area roughly the size of Greece. By August, the fires burning in Sakha alone were larger than every other active wildfire on the planet combined. Smoke rolled into the city and did not leave for weeks. Air quality monitors in Yakutsk registered particulate levels 40 times the World Health Organization's safety limit. Local monitoring services described the conditions with a word that had never been used for this city before. Airpocalypse. Flights were grounded. Residents were ordered to stay indoors. The smoke was so thick it turned day into night. According to NASA, the smoke plume traveled more than 1,800 miles and reached the North Pole, which scientists said appeared to be a first in recorded history. The coldest city on Earth was choking on smoke from fires caused by heat, and this is where the collision becomes visible. Yakutsk was built on a promise, the promise that the ground would stay frozen. Every design decision, every engineering choice, every pipe running above the surface and every building raised on stilts, all of it assumes one thing: permanence. The permafrost is permanent. It is in the name. But permafrost is not permanent. It is temperature dependent, and the temperature is changing. Across Russia, permafrost has warmed by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius since the 1970s. That may sound small. It is not. In Yakutsk, studies have found that approximately 10% of buildings already show structural deformation, cracks running through walls, foundations shifting. In other permafrost cities like Vorkuta, the number reaches 80%. Across the country, research from the Melnikov Permafrost Institute in Yakutsk itself projects that Russia could face $97 billion in infrastructure damage by 2050 if warming continues at its current pace. Foundation support in parts of northwest Siberia has declined by 17% between 1990 and 2010, compared to the previous 3 decades, in some locations up to 45%. The buildings were designed for a world that no longer exists. They assumed the ground was eternal, and now the ground is moving. But it is not just the buildings. Beneath the permafrost, there are things that were never meant to surface. In 2016, on the Yamal Peninsula in northern Siberia, temperatures spiked. Permafrost thawed, and from the newly exposed ground emerged the carcass of a reindeer that had been frozen for decades. Inside it, anthrax spores, preserved and viable. The resulting outbreak killed over 2,000 reindeer and hospitalized dozens of people. Across the Arctic, scientists estimate that between 13,000 and 20,000 contaminated sites sit locked within permafrost. Old military bases, toxic waste dumps, mining refuse, all sealed by cold, all depending on a seal that is weakening. And there is something else beneath the ice that Yakutsk depends on: diamonds. The Republic of Sakha produces roughly 90% of Russia's diamonds, and Russia accounts for about a third of global production. The company Alrosa, headquartered in the region, employs around 35,000 people and generates the economic engine that transformed Yakutsk from a remote outpost into a modern city with an opera house, a federal university, museums, and shopping centers. At one point in the late 1990s, diamond revenues accounted for nearly 44% of the entire republic's budget. The city does not merely sit on permafrost, it sits on wealth. And the wealth demands extraction. The Mir mine, about 500 miles west of Yakutsk, is one of the largest diamond pits ever dug, over 1,700 feet deep and nearly 4,000 feet across. When it was operating as an open pit mine, the temperature difference between the frigid air above and the warmer air trapped inside the crater reportedly generated downdrafts powerful enough that helicopters were forbidden from flying over it. The mine was so productive it helped the Soviet Union enter the global diamond market for the first time in the late 1950s. In 2025, Alrosa announced the discovery of the largest diamond ever mined in Russia from that same site, 468 carats. The diamonds are the reason Yakutsk grew. They brought workers, infrastructure, money, but every new building requires piles driven into permafrost. Every new road transfers heat into the ground. Every expansion of the city increases the pressure on the one thing that must not change. The wealth comes from beneath the frozen earth, and extracting it destabilizes the frozen earth that holds everything above. There is a deeper layer to this collision that most outsiders never see. The Sakha people, also known as Yakuts, are a Turkic-speaking indigenous group who make up roughly 60% of the republic's population. They migrated to this region centuries before the Russians arrived, adapting to the extreme climate through practices that existed in careful balance with the frozen land. Reindeer herding, horse breeding in the open steppe, fishing through river ice. Each summer solstice, they celebrate Isyak, a festival of renewal and gratitude for the brief warmth. For the Sakha, the land is not an obstacle, it is identity, and the permafrost that is now cracking under modern infrastructure is the same ground their ancestors chose, deliberately, as home. The people of Yakutsk are not unaware. The Melnikov Permafrost Institute, one of the most important research centers of its kind, operates in the city. Scientists there monitor ground temperatures, track seasonal thaw depths, and model what the coming decades will look like. Russia has announced plans to deploy 140 monitoring stations across the permafrost zone, some with wells reaching nearly 100 feet deep, to measure the speed of the thaw in real time. But monitoring is not the same as stopping it, and the projections are not encouraging. By 2050, an estimated 70% of all infrastructure built on permafrost across the Arctic could be at high risk, not just in Russia, in Alaska, in northern Canada, across the Tibetan Plateau, where over 10 million people live on permafrost that is warming at twice the global average. Yakutsk is not an anomaly, it is a preview. Today, if you visit Yakutsk in winter, you will see a city that functions against all logic. Open-air markets where vendors stand for hours in temperatures that would incapacitate most humans, their breath crystallizing before it leaves their mouths. Children walking to school with only their eyes exposed, navigating through ice fog so dense that buildings across the street are invisible. A skyline of apartment blocks hovering above the earth, each one a small act of defiance against a landscape that was never meant to hold a city. Nearly 4 centuries after Cossack soldiers built the first wooden fort on the banks of the Lena River, Yakutsk has a university, a philharmonic, a mammoth museum housing Ice Age fossils pulled from the very permafrost that supports the building. It is one of the most extraordinary feats of human adaptation on the planet, and yet it is also a city without a permanent road connection to the rest of Russia. For almost 400 years, reaching Yakutsk by land meant either crossing the Lena River by ferry in summer or driving over its frozen surface in winter. Construction of the first highway bridge did not begin until 2024, with an estimated completion date of 2028 and a price tag of over $1 billion. A city of nearly 400,000, sitting on billions of dollars in diamonds, accessible only by air or by ice. But beneath the surface, the ground that holds it all is shifting. Roads outside the city have begun to warp, buckling into waves where the earth was flat just decades ago. Fields that were once level enough for football are now landscapes of strange mounds and hollows. In the city itself, older buildings are showing the fractures that come from foundations in motion. The permafrost that was supposed to be permanent is behaving like something temporary. The coldest city on Earth is not being destroyed by winter. It is being destroyed by the heat it needs to survive. Every apartment radiating warmth through its floor. every engine idling through the long, dark months. Every breath of warm air that rises and cannot escape the ice fog. The city exists because of the cold, and the city is killing the cold. Yakutsk is not alone. Across the Arctic, more than 15 million people live on ground that is slowly changing state. 65% of Russian territory sits on permafrost. Cities, pipelines, railways, military installations, entire economies built on the assumption that frozen means forever. It does not. And as the Arctic warms at more than twice the global average, the clock is running on a transformation that cannot be reversed. The question is not whether the ground will thaw. The question is what we will do when it does. There is a place on this channel where an entire nation was built on a single resource that promised eternal wealth and delivered total collapse. The parallels to Yakutsk are unsettling, but the ending is even worse. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you on Impossible Lands.